In the suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, there was a grocery store called Green Haven, known for its diverse clientele and bustling aisles. On a busy Friday morning, a woman strode purposefully down the produce section. Amara Johnson, a 35-year-old black woman, carried an air of quiet determination born from years of overcoming obstacles. She was a single mother juggling night law school classes and volunteer work at a local community center. As Amara inspected a sack of apples, she felt an odd sensation, the kind of sixth sense that told her she was being watched. Across the aisle stood Gary Whitman, a middle-aged white man in a crisp suit and tie, his eyes fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. Gary, the head of Green Haven Security, had a reputation for being firm, even zealous in his duties. Behind his professional demeanor lurked unspoken biases that often shaped his actions. Amara brushed off the feeling and moved on to the dairy section, checking items off her grocery list. Yet she couldn't shake the awareness that Gary was following her. His presence lingered at the edge of her vision, and she could feel his eyes scrutinizing her every move. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" Gary asked, his voice courteous but with a sharp undertone. Amara glanced up, startled but composed. "No, thank you. I'm just finishing my shopping," she replied, her tone polite but firm. Gary didn't leave. His gaze lingered, scanning her cart as though he were a predator sizing up prey. Amara continued her shopping, her movements calm and deliberate, but her mind raced. When she reached the self-checkout area, Gary trailed her at a distance, speaking in hushed tones to a nearby employee. She paid for her items, slid her receipt into her bag, and began heading toward the exit. Then the alarm blared. Amara froze, stunned as heads turned in her direction. Her heart pounded as Gary approached swiftly, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me to the security office," he said, his grip firm as he placed a hand on her arm. "What's going on?" Amara asked, her voice edged with disbelief. "We believe an item was taken without being paid for," Gary stated flatly, signaling to a cashier to hold her cart. A wave of indignation surged through Amara. "That's impossible." "I paid for everything," she said, holding up her receipt. Gary shook his head, his tone unyielding. "We'll confirm that in the security office." The walk back into the store felt like a walk of shame. Customers and employees alike stared, some whispering, others gawking. Amara held her head high, but inside, a storm brewed. She was no stranger to moments like these, moments when the color of her skin seemed to carry more weight than the truth. In the small windowless security room, Gary sat at a console of monitors while Amara was directed to a chair. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, amplifying the tension in the air. "Let's take a look," Gary said as he clicked through surveillance footage. He stopped at a clip from the produce aisle. On the screen, it appeared that Amara had slipped an item into her coat pocket. "There it is," Gary declared, crossing his arms. "Do you want to admit it now and save us all some trouble?" Amara leaned closer to the monitor, her eyes narrowing. "This is out of context. I wasn't stealing anything. I was reorganizing my things," she explained, her voice steady but laced with anger. Gary smirked, his posture rigid. "That's what they all say. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." Amara felt her jaw tighten. "You're accusing me of theft based on a distorted clip. That's not proof. It's harassment." Gary's expression hardened further. "Ma'am, I have the authority to call the police. This doesn't need to escalate, but that's up to you." Amara took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew this situation was bigger than just her. It was about the countless others who had been falsely accused, humiliated, or criminalized based on nothing but suspicion and prejudice. Meanwhile, in the corner of the room, a younger employee named David Lopez watched silently. David, a quiet observer by nature, recognized Amara. She was well known in the neighborhood for her tireless community work and advocacy. He'd attended one of her workshops on renters' rights. Seeing her treated this way sparked a conflict within him, but Gary's domineering presence kept him from speaking up. The room seemed to shrink as tension thickened. Amara sat upright, her composure unwavering despite the humiliation she felt boiling beneath the surface. She met Gary's eyes, her voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "You have no idea what kind of mistake you're making." Gary raised an eyebrow, leaning against the desk as though to assert his authority. "This isn't a mistake. The evidence is clear," he retorted, Amara clenched her fists under the table. The stakes were high, not just for her reputation but for her dignity and her role in her community. She was determined not to let this go unanswered. David hesitated, glancing between Gary and Amara. Something in her voice struck a chord, stirring his conscience. As Gary prepared to dial the police, David cleared his throat. Gary, maybe we should check the other cameras first. You know, for a full picture." Gary shot him a glare. "We've seen enough." "No," Amara interjected. "If you're going to accuse me, then you owe me the courtesy of checking every angle. That's the bare minimum." Her voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Gary hesitated for a fraction of a second before reluctantly scrolling through additional footage. The clock ticked loudly, each second stretching into eternity. Amara's heart raced, but her face remained stoic. This was a battle she couldn't afford to lose, not just for herself, but for every marginalized person forced to defend their innocence against biased assumptions. As Gary played more footage, David leaned closer to the screen. "Wait, look there. She's putting something back on the shelf. That's not theft." Gary froze. His face paled slightly as the realization dawned. The Greenhaven grocery store was more than just a local market. It was a microcosm of the surrounding Atlanta neighborhood. It mirrored the city's sharp contrasts: affluence and poverty, diversity and division, opportunity and systemic inequality. The store's neatly stacked shelves and brightly lit aisles painted a picture of order, but beneath that surface, the tensions of a divided community simmered. Amara Johnson was intimately familiar with these contrasts. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, she had learned early on how to navigate a world that often underestimated her. Her mother had been a civil rights activist, and her father, a union organizer. From them, Amara inherited not only her unshakable sense of justice but also the courage to confront it head-on. She'd spent her 20s balancing her job as a social worker with raising her now 10-year-old son, Malik, who was her anchor in every storm. Amara's life wasn't easy, but it was purposeful. Every day she fought for a better future for her son. She organized community cleanups, led workshops on tenant rights, and volunteered at local food banks. Her goal was simple: to show her neighbors that they mattered, even when society told them otherwise. But in moments like this, sitting in the cold, fluorescent-lit security room, with a man like Gary Whitman accusing her of theft, Amara was reminded of how easily all her work could be dismissed. Gary was the embodiment of a different kind of power. He was a man who thrived on control and certainty, a former police officer who had transitioned into private security after a departmental scandal forced him into early retirement. He prided himself on his ability to spot trouble from a mile away, often claiming that his instincts were never wrong. But Gary's so-called instincts were rooted in something far more insidious: unconscious bias and the unchecked privilege that allowed him to act on it. His world was one of rigid rules and black and white judgments. In his mind, people like Amara didn't belong in the safe parts of town unless they could prove their innocence at every turn. Watching from the periphery was David Lopez, a 22-year-old stock clerk who had recently transferred to Greenhaven from another branch. David's quiet demeanor often led people to underestimate him, but he was observant, keenly aware of the dynamics at play in the store. Growing up as a first-generation Mexican-American, David had his own experiences with being singled out and scrutinized. He recognized the humiliation on Amara's face because he'd felt it himself. David admired Amara, even if she didn't know it. He had attended her community workshops, sitting in the back row as she passionately explained renters' rights and how to challenge discriminatory practices. Seeing her in this vulnerable position, her dignity questioned, stirred something in him. But he also knew how precarious his job was. Greenhaven didn't exactly encourage employees to challenge authority, and Gary had a reputation for making trouble disappear, employees included. Meanwhile, outside the security office, the world continued. Customers went about their business, unaware of the drama unfolding behind closed doors. But the employees whispered amongst themselves. News of Amara's detention had already spread, and opinions were divided. Some were quick to assume guilt, while others, particularly those who knew Amara from her community work, were appalled. Amara's son Malik was at home, waiting for his mother to return with groceries. He was too young to fully understand the weight of what his mother faced daily, but he was old enough to sense her exhaustion on the hard days. Malik often stayed up late drawing pictures of superheroes, leaving them on her nightstand as a reminder of her strength. For Amara, Malik was the reason she never let herself falter. As she sat in that room facing Gary's cold, unyielding gaze, she thought of her son. She thought of the example she needed to set for him, not just to stand up for herself, but for every person who had ever been wrongly accused, silenced, or dismissed. Gary, meanwhile, saw this moment as a test of his authority. He had spent years crafting his narrative as a protector of order, and to admit he was wrong now would shatter that illusion. The very thought was unthinkable to him, but the dynamics in the room were shifting. David's tentative suggestion to review the footage had planted a seed of doubt, and Amara's refusal to back down had thrown Gary off balance. The larger world outside this room, the city of Atlanta, was no stranger to stories like this. In this city of civil rights history, where leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. once marched, the struggle for justice had never truly ended. It was a city where progress and prejudice collided daily, and where people like Amara fought to carve out spaces of dignity and fairness. Back in the security room, the tension crackled like static electricity. David stepped closer to the monitor, scrolling through the footage. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "Gary, I really think we need to look at this from another angle," he said, his words carrying a quiet determination that belied his usual timidity. Amara glanced at David, her eyes narrowing. She didn't know him well, but in that moment, she saw an ally, a flicker of courage in a place she hadn't expected. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier with every passing second. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the Greenhaven parking lot. But inside, something far more profound was unfolding. A battle not just for truth, but for the soul of a community. The security room at Greenhaven had transformed into a silent battleground. The stakes were no longer about a misplaced grocery item, but about trust, dignity, and justice. Amara sat upright, her calm defiance creating a stark contrast to Gary's rigid demeanor. David stood by the monitor, hesitant yet resolute, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Gary's finger hovered over the phone on the desk, his jaw clenched. The idea of calling the police appealed to him, not because he had solid evidence, but because it was a familiar script. Yet something about Amara's unflinching gaze unsettled him. She wasn't pleading or apologizing. She was challenging him, and it wasn't something he was used to. "Let me remind you," Gary said, his voice low and deliberate, "that refusing to cooperate only makes things worse." Amara leaned forward, her voice razor-sharp. "And let me remind you, Gary, that accusing someone without solid evidence is called defamation. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about your reckless abuse of power." Gary bristled. He wasn't used to his authority being questioned so openly. "You think you can intimidate me?" he asked, his voice rising. "No," Amara shot back, "but I do expect you to do your job properly. So, are we going to review the footage or keep playing this game?" David, emboldened by her words, stepped in. "She's right, we need to be thorough," he said, his voice firmer than before. "It's protocol to review all angles before escalating." Gary glared at him. "Since when do you dictate protocol here?" David's pulse quickened, but he held his ground. "It's not about me. It's about getting this right." Reluctantly, Gary gestured for David to continue reviewing the footage. As the young clerk navigated through different camera angles, the room grew quieter, the tension thick as molasses. Amara watched intently, her heart pounding as she willed the truth to surface. Finally, David paused on a clip from a different angle. It showed Amara rearranging items in her cart, her movements deliberate but innocuous. The footage clearly contradicted the earlier clip, which had been misleading due to the camera's position. "There," David said, pointing to the screen. "She's not stealing, she's just moving stuff around." Amara exhaled, a mixture of relief and fury washing over her. Gary's face hardened, his jaw tightening as the implications sank in. He'd made a mistake, a public, damning mistake, and there was no easy way out of it. "That doesn't prove anything," Gary muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Amara stood up, her eyes blazing. "Enough. You accused me, humiliated me, and dragged me through this based on your assumptions. Now you're grasping at straws to save face." Gary's facade began to crack. His authority, built on bluster and bias, was crumbling in the face of Amara's unwavering resolve. The door to the security office opened suddenly, and the store manager, Rachel Nguyen, stepped inside. A no-nonsense woman in her 40s, Rachel had been alerted to the commotion by concerned employees. She surveyed the scene quickly. Amara standing tall, Gary visibly flustered, and David nervously pointing at the screen. "What's going on here?" Rachel asked, her tone sharp. Gary straightened, attempting to regain control. "There was a theft alarm. I was investigating." "Wrongfully," Amara interjected. "He accused me without evidence. And now, after reviewing the footage, it's clear I did nothing wrong." Rachel turned to David. "Is this true?" David nodded. "The footage clears her. She didn't take anything." Rachel's expression darkened as she turned to Gary. "We'll talk later," she said curtly before addressing Amara. "Ms. Johnson, I deeply apologize for what you've been through. This isn't how we do things here." Amara folded her arms. "It shouldn't be how you do things anywhere." Rachel nodded, her face tinged with shame. "You're absolutely right. We'll review our protocols and ensure this doesn't happen again." Amara stared at her for a moment, weighing her words. Then she said, "It's not enough to review protocols. You need to address the biases that let this happen in the first place. Otherwise, it'll just keep happening." Rachel's shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of the truth. "You're right," she said softly, "and I'll personally make sure we do better." Gary opened his mouth to protest, but Rachel silenced him with a glare. "Take the rest of the day off, Gary. We'll discuss this later." As Gary reluctantly left the room, David turned to Amara. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I should have spoken up sooner." Amara gave him a small, appreciative nod. "You did the right thing in the end. That's what matters." The air in the room shifted, the immediate crisis diffused. But for Amara, this wasn't over. The humiliation, the injustice, it wasn't something she could let go of easily. As she left the security office and stepped back into the store, her mind was already racing with ideas. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had been judged unfairly, who had been made to feel small because of someone else's prejudice. She would ensure that Gary and Greenhaven were held accountable, not just for what happened to her, but for what could happen to others. Outside, the sky was darkening, the sun sinking below the horizon. Amara walked to her car, her steps purposeful. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As the evening settled over Atlanta, Amara sat in her small living room, replaying the events at Greenhaven in her mind. Malik sat at the dining table, working on his homework. Every so often, he glanced at his mother, sensing her unease but knowing better than to interrupt her thoughts. Amara opened her laptop and began drafting an email to a local civil rights organization. She detailed the incident in crisp, objective language, attaching the receipt she'd kept and outlining the blatant bias she'd endured. Her hands trembled as she typed, not from fear but from determination. The email wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was the first step in a larger plan. Amara knew this wasn't an isolated incident. How many others had been wrongly accused, humiliated, or even criminalized simply because someone assumed the worst of them? Her phone buzzed, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Erica Wells, a journalist and an old friend. Amara had reached out to her earlier, briefly explaining the situation. "Amara, this is a big story. Can I come over tomorrow to get the full details?" Amara smiled faintly. Erica was known for her fearless reporting on issues of racial injustice and systemic inequality. If anyone could amplify this story, it was her. Meanwhile, at Greenhaven, the fallout from the incident was beginning to take root. In the break room, whispers circulated among the employees. Gary Whitman's actions had drawn criticism from some and support from others, creating a palpable divide. David Lopez found himself at the center of the discussion. Some colleagues commended him for standing up for the truth, while others warned him to stay in line. "You should have kept your mouth shut," said Mark Stevens, a senior employee who had worked with Gary for years. "You don't know how these things work. Gary won't forget this." David frowned but didn't respond. He couldn't shake the image of Amara's face when she'd been accused. He didn't regret speaking up, but the unease lingered. In another corner of the store, Rachel Nguyen, the store manager, was grappling with her own doubts. She'd long suspected that Gary's methods bordered on problematic, but she'd never confronted him. Now, with the incident gaining attention, she realized that her inaction had made her complicit. Rachel sat in her office, staring at a blank report template, Corporate would demand a full account of what had happened, and she needed to decide whether to protect Gary or tell the truth. Across town, Erica Wells prepared for her interview with Amara. She scoured her notes, researching similar cases of racial profiling in retail settings. She came across alarming statistics. African Americans were disproportionately accused of shoplifting, even when no evidence supported the claims. Her research uncovered a recent class action lawsuit against a major retailer, where customers had been profiled and detained under similar circumstances. The parallels were striking, and Erica knew this wasn't just a local story. It was a systemic issue. When Erica arrived at Amara's house the next morning, the two women embraced briefly before settling in the living room. Malik, curious but shy, peeked around the corner before retreating to his room. Erica set up her recorder. "Start from the beginning," she said gently. Amara recounted the events, her voice steady but charged with emotion. She spoke not just of the humiliation, but of the broader implications. The ways people of color are treated with suspicion in spaces where they should feel safe. "This wasn't just about me," Amara said. "This is about a culture that assumes guilt based on the color of your skin, and it has to stop." Erica nodded, jotting down notes. "What's your next step?" Amara hesitated. "I'm not sure yet, but I know I won't let this slide." At Greenhaven, the tension reached a boiling point. Rachel called Gary into her office for a private meeting. He entered with his usual bravado, but the strain was evident. "Gary," Rachel began, her voice measured, "we need to talk about what happened yesterday." Gary scoffed. "It was a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job." Rachel folded her hands on the desk. "Your job isn't to act on assumptions. It's to ensure the safety and fairness of everyone in this store. What you did wasn't just unprofessional, it was harmful." Gary's face darkened. "So now you're taking her side?" Rachel leaned forward. "I'm taking the side of what's right, and corporate will want answers. You need to prepare for the possibility that your actions will have consequences." Gary stormed out of the office, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he felt his authority slipping away. The story began to spread. Erica's article, titled "Presumed Guilty, Racial Profiling at Greenhaven," was published 2 days later. It quickly gained traction online, shared across social media platforms with hashtags like "SocialJustice for Amara" and "Stop Racial Profiling." Comments flooded in, some supportive, others dismissive. Amara found herself thrust into the spotlight, receiving calls from activists, lawyers, and even strangers who shared their own experiences of discrimination. She also received backlash. Anonymous messages accused her of playing the victim and exaggerating the issue, but Amara refused to be silenced. One night, as she scrolled through messages of both support and hate, Malik approached her with a drawing. It was a picture of her wearing a cape, standing tall with her hands on her hips. Beneath it, he'd written, "You're my hero, Mom." Tears welled in Amara's eyes as she hugged him tightly. In that moment, she resolved to turn this painful experience into something meaningful. The web of complexities continued to grow, pulling in new players and amplifying the stakes. For Amara, the journey was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about confronting the deep-seated biases that had led to this moment and demanding change in a society that desperately needed it. A week after the incident at Greenhaven, Amara stood outside a courthouse in downtown Atlanta. A light drizzle fell, dampening the sidewalks but not her resolve. Beside her stood Erica, holding a notebook, and 2 lawyers from a civil rights advocacy group. Behind them, a small but vocal group of supporters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "End Racial Profiling." This was no longer just about Amara. It had become a rallying cry for systemic change. The civil rights group had filed a formal discrimination complaint against Greenhaven and its parent company. Amara, now the face of the movement, was preparing to speak at a press conference. She took a deep breath as the cameras focused on her. "Last week," she began, her voice steady, "I was accused of theft without evidence, humiliated in front of strangers, and treated as guilty until proven innocent. This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless others who face judgment based on the color of their skin, their background, or their perceived place in society." Amara paused, her eyes scanning the crowd. "This fight isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. We're here today to demand accountability and systemic change, Not just apologies, but action. The crowd erupted into applause as Amara stepped back. Erica gave her a reassuring nod, while the lawyers outlined the specifics of the legal action being taken. At Greenhaven, Gary Whitman was beginning to feel the full weight of his decisions. The corporate office had launched an internal investigation, and his position was under scrutiny. The store's usual routine had been upended as training sessions on anti-discrimination policies were hastily scheduled, and tensions among the staff escalated. Rachel Nguyen, the store manager, had taken an active role in addressing the aftermath. She met with employees in small groups, encouraging open discussions about bias and fairness. For the first time, many of them felt comfortable sharing stories of their own encounters with Gary's overreach. David Lopez, who had been avoiding Gary since the incident, was summoned to Rachel's office. "David," she said, "I want to thank you for speaking up that day. It couldn't have been easy." David shifted in his seat. "I just did what was right. I couldn't stay quiet." Rachel nodded. "That kind of courage is exactly what we need more of here, and it's something I should have shown sooner." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Gary, his expression grim. "Rachel, can I speak with you?" he asked. David stood up to leave, but Rachel gestured for him to stay. "No, Gary, you can speak in front of both of us." Gary hesitated, the power dynamic shifting in a way he wasn't accustomed to. "I've been with this company for over a decade," he began, "and I've always done what I thought was necessary to protect it. If I overstepped, I apologize." Rachel's face remained neutral. "Overstepping isn't the issue, Gary. It's about the impact of your actions, the harm they've caused, not just to Amara but to this entire community. That's not something an apology can fix." Gary opened his mouth to respond but thought better of it. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. Amara's story continued to gain momentum. Social media platforms amplified her voice, and her story was picked up by national news outlets. She appeared on morning shows and podcasts, speaking with a clarity and passion that resonated with audiences far beyond Atlanta. During one particularly emotional interview, Amara revealed a vulnerable side. "Part of me wanted to shrink away from all of this," she admitted, "to go back to my quiet life, but I couldn't. I kept thinking about my son, Malik, and what kind of world he's growing up in. I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in a system that thrives on silence." Malik, watching the interview from their couch at home, beamed with pride. "That's my mom," he said to Erica, who had stopped by to deliver a printed copy of her latest article. "You're lucky to have her," Erica said, smiling. Behind the scenes, Greenhaven's corporate office faced mounting pressure. Boycotts were organized, and calls for Gary's dismissal became louder. The company's PR team scrambled to control the narrative, issuing carefully worded statements about their commitment to inclusivity and fairness. But the damage had already been done. Rachel received an email from corporate outlining the results of their investigation. The decision was clear. Gary would be terminated, and the store would undergo a complete overhaul of its security policies. When Rachel broke the news to Gary, he didn't argue. Instead, he quietly packed his things, leaving behind an empty office and a legacy of mistrust. The real turning point came during a town hall meeting organized by the community. Amara was invited to speak alongside local activists and business leaders. The event was held in a packed church with standing room only. Amara spoke last, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "This isn't just about one store or one man," she said. "This is about all of us, about how we treat each other, how we hold systems accountable, and how we demand better from the institutions that serve us." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I'm not here to burn bridges. I'm here to build new ones. But building requires effort, and it requires all of us to take a hard look at ourselves. It's not enough to be not racist. We need to be actively anti-racist." The crowd rose to their feet, applauding her words. Amara felt a swell of emotion, hope, pride, and determination all at once. The turning point had shifted the trajectory of Amara's journey. What began as a single act of injustice had become a movement, forcing a community and a corporation to confront uncomfortable truths. But for Amara, the fight was far from over. She was just getting started. In the days following the town hall, the ripples of Amara's fight spread further than she could have imagined. News outlets continued to cover the story, not just as an isolated incident, but as a lens into the broader issue of racial profiling in America. Green Haven, once a bustling neighborhood staple, saw its reputation falter as calls for accountability grew louder. Amara, however, felt the weight of her decisions more acutely at home. Sitting at her kitchen table one evening, she watched Malik work on his science project. His laughter filled the room as he tested a small circuit he'd built, and for a moment the tension in her chest eased. "Mom," Malik said, looking up with wide eyes, "do you think they're going to change things at the store?" Amara smiled faintly. "I think they'll have to, sweetheart. But it won't happen overnight. That's why we have to keep pushing." Malik nodded solemnly, his young mind trying to grasp the enormity of the battle his mother was fighting. At Greenhaven, the consequences were unavoidable. Customers who had once trusted the store now looked at it with suspicion. Sales dropped sharply, and the company announced the temporary closure of the location for restructuring and training. Inside the store, the employees left behind struggled to adapt. Rachel Nguyen, determined to turn things around, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust. She scheduled mandatory training sessions on unconscious bias and racial equity, hiring a diversity consultant to lead the efforts. Rachel also initiated one-on-one conversations with her team, creating a space for them to share their experiences. She was surprised to hear just how many of her employees had stories of feeling marginalized or mistreated by Gary Whitman. David Lopez was one of the few who seemed cautiously optimistic about the changes. One afternoon, Rachel approached him as he stocked shelves. "David, I wanted to thank you again for what you did," she said. "It's not easy to stand up like that." David nodded, keeping his eyes on his work. "It just felt like the right thing to do, but I'm not sure it'll change anything." Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder. "It will. It's going to take time, but it will." For Amara, the reactions from the broader community were mixed. While many supported her, there were those who dismissed her as a troublemaker or accused her of overreacting. Social media became a battleground, with hashtags like #SocialJustice for Amara trending alongside criticism and hateful messages. One evening, as Amara scrolled through the barrage of comments, a particularly cruel message caught her eye. "Stop playing the victim. People like you always make everything about race." Amara felt the familiar sting of frustration and exhaustion, but before she could close the app, she saw another comment beneath it. "Amara isn't playing the victim. She's standing up for all of us who've been treated unfairly. We need more people like her." The words brought a small smile to her face. She leaned back in her chair, reminded that for every detractor, there were countless others who believed in her fight. The corporate office of Greenhaven wasn't spared. The parent company's executives faced increasing pressure from advocacy groups and the public. To salvage their image, they announced sweeping changes: a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory practices, the introduction of a customer rights charter, and the establishment of a diversity task force. Still, the company's efforts felt hollow to Amara. To her, real change required more than press releases and training sessions. It required a cultural shift, a willingness to confront the deep-seated biases that had allowed the incident to occur in the first place. In the community, the story had a galvanizing effect. Local activists organized workshops on knowing your rights, empowering residents to stand up against injustice. Amara was invited to speak at many of these events, her voice becoming a symbol of resilience and hope. At one such workshop, a young woman approached her after the session. "Ms. Johnson," she said shyly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've always been scared to speak up, but seeing you fight back has made me realize I can too." Amara's heart swelled with gratitude. "It's not always easy," she said, "but every voice matters. Keep standing up for yourself and others. That's how we create change." Not everyone escaped accountability unscathed. Gary Whitman, now unemployed and facing public scrutiny, filed a wrongful termination lawsuit against Greenhaven, claiming he was being scapegoated. The suit quickly became a point of contention, with many seeing it as a desperate attempt to avoid responsibility. Amara's lawyers kept her updated, but she chose not to focus on Gary's actions. For her, the fight was bigger than one man. It was about dismantling the system that enabled him. One evening, after tucking Malik into bed, Amara sat on her balcony, reflecting on how far she had come since that fateful day at Greenhaven. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a reminder of both the challenges ahead and the victories already won. Her phone buzzed with a notification. A message from Erica Wells. Breaking news. Greenhaven to partner with local advocacy groups to implement new anti-bias initiatives. Your fight is making waves. Amara smiled, the weight on her shoulders feeling a little lighter. Change was happening slowly but surely, and she wouldn't stop until it was felt by everyone who needed it. As the weeks turned into months, Amara's fight for justice evolved into a broader mission for systemic change. The incident at Greenhaven had been a catalyst, but the journey ahead required resilience, strategy, and a growing network of allies. Amara's advocacy began to take shape beyond the headlines. She partnered with local civil rights groups, including the same organization that had supported her legal complaint. Together, they launched a campaign titled Justice Beyond the Aisles, aimed at addressing racial profiling not just in retail but in other public spaces as well. Community centers across Atlanta hosted workshops on racial equity, led by Amara and other advocates. The sessions drew crowds of people eager to share their stories and learn how to recognize and combat systemic biases. At one such event, Amara met Samantha Reed, a Black business owner who ran a small bookstore nearby. Samantha had her own experiences with profiling and microaggressions, and the two women bonded over their shared determination to create a safer, more inclusive community. "You know," Samantha said over coffee one afternoon, "we could build something bigger out of this. What if we create a coalition, a place where local businesses, activists, and everyday people can come together to address these issues head-on?" Amara's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need. A united front." Meanwhile, the Greenhaven store reopened under new management. Rachel Nguyen, now fully committed to transforming the store's culture, had implemented sweeping changes. She hired a new security team, ensuring they were trained in de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. She also installed signs at every entrance, declaring the store a safe and inclusive space for all. David Lopez had been promoted to assistant manager, a decision Rachel made in recognition of his integrity and commitment. Despite his new role, David remained grounded, often reminding himself of the lessons he'd learned from witnessing Amara's courage. One afternoon, Rachel invited Amara to visit the store. "I know this place holds bad memories for you," Rachel said, her voice tinged with regret, "but I want you to see the changes we've made." Amara hesitated but agreed. As she walked through the store's aisles, she noticed the difference immediately. The atmosphere was lighter, the staff friendlier, and the once overbearing security presence had been replaced with approachable employees trained to assist, rather than accuse. "This is a start," Amara said, turning to Rachel. "But remember, real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes consistent effort." Rachel nodded. "I know, and I'm committed to making it happen." On the personal front, Amara faced challenges she hadn't anticipated. Balancing her newfound role as an advocate with her responsibilities as a mother and law student wasn't easy. Late nights were spent poring over legal textbooks or drafting proposals for the coalition Samantha had proposed. Malik often found her asleep at her desk, a blanket draped over her shoulders. "Mom, you work too hard," he said one morning, handing her a cup of coffee he'd prepared himself. Amara chuckled, ruffling his hair. "I do it for us, Malik. For you." Her son's unwavering support became her anchor. On days when the weight of her work felt unbearable, his bright smile reminded her of why she had started this fight in the first place. The coalition, now named the Equity Alliance, held its first official meeting 3 months later. Dozens of local business owners, activists, and community members gathered in the basement of a church. Samantha and Amara co-led the session, outlining their goals: educating businesses on anti-discrimination practices, providing resources for individuals facing bias, and advocating for policy changes at the city level. "Change starts here," Amara said to the group. "It starts with all of us refusing to accept the status quo." Her words resonated deeply, sparking a wave of enthusiasm among the attendees. The coalition quickly gained traction, securing partnerships with larger organizations and drawing attention from city officials. The journey wasn't without setbacks. Some business owners resisted the idea of mandatory bias training, arguing that it was unnecessary or burdensome. Online trolls continued to target Amara, accusing her of seeking attention or exploiting the situation for personal gain. One particularly difficult day, Amara confided in Samantha. Sometimes it feels like for every step forward, we take 2 steps back, she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Samantha placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. That's because real change is hard, she said, but it's worth it. Look at how far we've come already. Amara nodded, drawing strength from her friend's words. Amara's persistence began to bear fruit. The Equity Alliance secured funding to expand its reach, and the City Council agreed to adopt new policies requiring anti-discrimination training for all public-facing employees in Atlanta businesses. Amara's work also inspired others to step forward. Community members who had been silent for years began sharing their own stories of injustice, creating a ripple effect that spread beyond Atlanta. One evening, Amara received an unexpected email. It was from a former Green Haven employee who had worked under Gary Whitman. "I've been thinking about what happened," the email read. "I was afraid to speak up back then, but I want you to know that your courage has inspired me. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to do the right thing." Amara felt a lump in her throat as she read the words. It was a reminder that change wasn't always visible, but it was happening, one person at a time. As she stood on the steps of City Hall weeks later, addressing a crowd gathered to celebrate the Equity Alliance's latest victory, Amara looked out at the faces before her. Malik was in the front row, grinning proudly, holding a handmade sign that read, "My mom is a superhero." Amara smiled, her voice steady as she began to speak. "This fight started with an injustice, but it has grown into something so much bigger. It's about the power of community, the strength of standing together, and the belief that we can create a better future for all of us." The applause was deafening, but Amara's heart was calm. She knew this was only the beginning. 6 months after the Green Haven incident, Amara found herself standing at the intersection of personal triumph and broader change. The Equity Alliance had grown from a small coalition into a citywide movement, with partnerships extending to legal advocacy groups, schools, and even national organizations. But the battle was far from over. The coalition had set its sights on a landmark goal: persuading the Atlanta City Council to pass the Community Accountability Act, a sweeping piece of legislation designed to combat racial profiling and implement mandatory bias training across all public-facing businesses. It was ambitious, controversial, and fiercely contested by some. Amara sat in her living room late one evening, reviewing her speech for the upcoming City Council hearing. The house was quiet except for the rhythmic tapping of her pen against her notebook. Her thoughts were interrupted when her phone buzzed with a message from Erica Wells. "Amara, I just got a tip. Green Haven's parent company is planning to oppose the bill publicly. They're lobbying hard against it. Thought you should know." Amara sighed deeply. She had expected resistance, but knowing that her primary adversary was actively working against her added a new layer of complexity. She immediately called a meeting with the coalition's leadership team, including Samantha and their legal advisors. "We can't let them derail this," Amara said firmly, her eyes scanning the faces on the Zoom call. "If they go public, we need to be ready to counter their narrative. This bill isn't just about holding businesses accountable, it's about protecting people." Samantha nodded. "We need stories, real stories from the people this bill will help. They can't argue against the truth." In the days leading up to the hearing, tensions reached a fever pitch. Green Haven's parent company launched a PR campaign opposing the legislation, claiming it was too costly and unfairly targeted businesses. The media picked up the story, sparking heated debates on talk shows and social media. Amara became the face of the bill, a role that came with both support and backlash. Protesters began to gather outside her home, some holding signs of solidarity, others accusing her of stirring division. Malik, now acutely aware of the stakes, stayed close to her, asking questions she struggled to answer. "Why are some people so mad at you, Mom?" he asked one night as they sat on the couch. Amara looked into his earnest eyes. "Because change scares people, Malik. It makes them uncomfortable. But just because something is hard doesn't mean it's not worth fighting for." Malik nodded, his young mind processing her words. "You're like the heroes in my comics. They don't stop when things get tough." His words brought a tear to her eye. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot." As the hearing approached, the coalition worked tirelessly. They organized rallies, distributed pamphlets, and hosted town halls to educate the public about the bill. Amara personally reached out to community leaders, urging them to stand with her at the council meeting. David Lopez, now a visible advocate for change, volunteered to speak at the hearing. His testimony would highlight the perspective of employees who had witnessed discrimination firsthand, but had been afraid to act. "I need to do this," David told Amara during a planning session. "I've been quiet for too long. This is my chance to make things right." Amara placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your voice matters, David. I'm proud of you." The night before the hearing, Amara received an unexpected visitor. Rachel Nguyen stood on her doorstep, holding a thick envelope. "I thought you might need this," Rachel said, handing it over. Amara opened it to find a stack of documents, internal memos from Greenhaven's corporate office that outlined their opposition strategy. They detailed plans to discredit Amara's character and frame the legislation as a job killer. "How did you get these?" Amara asked, stunned. Rachel hesitated. "Let's just say not everyone at corporate agrees with their tactics. They wanted you to have a fighting chance." Amara's gratitude was tempered by a wave of indignation. The lengths to which Greenhaven would go to protect their bottom line were staggering. "Thank you, Rachel. This changes everything," Amara said, clutching the documents tightly. The day of the hearing dawned with a sense of urgency. The city council chamber was packed with activists, business owners, and community members. The atmosphere crackled with tension as both supporters and opponents of the bill prepared to make their cases. Amara sat near the front, flanked by Samantha and David. She clutched her prepared speech, but her mind raced with thoughts of the new evidence Rachel had provided. It was a powerful weapon, but using it meant risking further retaliation from Greenhaven. As the hearing began, speakers took turns addressing the council. Opponents of the bill, including representatives from Greenhaven, argued that it would place undue burdens on businesses, potentially leading to layoffs and closures. When it was her turn, Amara stood and walked to the podium, her heart pounding. She looked out at the crowd, spotting Malik's proud face in the front row. Drawing strength from him, she began to speak. "This isn't just about businesses or budgets," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about people, real people, who deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. What happened to me at Greenhaven wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a system that needs to change." Amara's words built in intensity, weaving her personal story with the broader implications of the bill. As she reached the climax of her speech, she paused. "And for those who question whether this bill is necessary, let me share something with you," she said, holding up the documents Rachel had given her. "These are internal memos from a company actively working to discredit this legislation. Not because it's bad for business, but because it threatens the status quo." Gasps rippled through the room as she handed copies to the council members. "This is why we need the Community Accountability Act. Because if we don't hold institutions accountable, they'll continue to prioritize profit over people." The room erupted in applause, but Amara remained composed. She had done her part. Now, it was up to the council to decide. The council chamber was electric with anticipation as the members deliberated behind closed doors. The room remained packed, the air thick with tension. Supporters of the Community Accountability Act clutched signs and whispered amongst themselves, while opponents huddled in tense silence. Amara sat near the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, Malik by her side. Erica Wells, seated a few rows back, tapped furiously on her laptop, preparing a draft article for whichever way the vote went. She leaned forward and whispered to Amara, "You've done everything you can. Whatever happens, this fight doesn't end here." Amara nodded, though the gravity of the moment pressed heavily on her. "This legislation sets a dangerous precedent," argued one council member. "It places an unfair burden on businesses, especially small ones." "But isn't it more dangerous to do nothing?" countered another. "We've heard story after story of people being profiled, harassed, and humiliated. Are we really going to ignore that?" The evidence Amara had presented loomed large in the discussion. The leaked memos from Greenhaven's corporate office revealed a coordinated effort to undermine the bill through misinformation and fear-mongering. For some council members, it was the tipping point. A hush fell over the crowd as the council chair took her seat. She glanced at the paper in front of her, then addressed the room. "After careful consideration and debate, We have reached a decision regarding the Community Accountability Act. Amara's heart pounded in her chest. Malik squeezed her hand, his small fingers warm and reassuring. The council has voted, the chair paused for dramatic effect, to pass the act by a margin of 8-3. The room erupted into cheers, applause drowning out the protests of a few detractors. Amara felt tears spring to her eyes as Malik threw his arms around her neck. "You did it, Mom," he exclaimed, his voice filled with pride. Amara smiled through her tears, holding her son tightly. Around her, supporters hugged, cheered, and cried. The culmination of months of tireless work and unrelenting determination had finally paid off. Amara couldn't ignore the murmurs of discontent from business owners and lobbyists leaving the chamber. One man muttered loudly enough for her to hear, "This'll bankrupt half the stores in this city." Instead of responding, Amara focused on the triumph of the moment. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult. The bill's implementation would require vigilance, ensuring it wasn't merely a symbolic gesture, but a genuine step toward systemic change. Later that evening, as supporters gathered at a local community center to celebrate, Amara stood at the podium once more. This time, her speech was filled with gratitude and determination. "Today, we proved that when we come together, we can achieve the impossible," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "But this is just the beginning. The Community Accountability Act is a tool, a framework for change. It's up to us to make sure it's enforced, to hold businesses and ourselves accountable, and to continue fighting for a world where everyone is treated with dignity." Her words were met with thunderous applause. Greenhaven issued a public statement acknowledging their past failures and pledging to comply fully with the new legislation. The store became a case study for reform, with Rachel Nguyen taking the lead in implementing the required changes. Rachel invited Amara to join a newly formed advisory board that would oversee the store's compliance and serve as a liaison between the business and the community. After some consideration, Amara accepted, recognizing the opportunity to influence change from within. David Lopez, now an integral part of Greenhaven's management, became a vocal advocate for fair treatment and equitable practices. His transformation from a quiet bystander to a confident leader inspired others within the organization. One evening, she sat with Malik on their couch, scrolling through photos from the hearing and the celebration that followed. Malik pointed to a picture of her standing at the podium, surrounded by cheering supporters. "You look like a superhero," he said with a grin. Amara laughed, pulling him into a hug. "Superheroes don't do it alone, Malik. They have teams, and I couldn't have done any of this without ours." Gary Whitman, now embittered and out of work, continued to wage his own campaign. He appeared on talk shows, painting himself as a scapegoat and railing against what he called a culture of overcorrection. His rhetoric resonated with a small but vocal audience, and he filed a new lawsuit against Greenhaven, claiming wrongful termination. Amara's lawyers monitored his moves, but advised her not to engage directly. Instead, she focused her energy on the next phase of her advocacy work, expanding the Equity Alliance's reach to neighboring cities. Late one night, after another successful town hall, she stood on her balcony, gazing at the city lights. She thought about the woman she had been the day she walked into Greenhaven, a determined but weary single mother, just trying to buy groceries. Now she was a leader, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. The journey had cost her, but it had also transformed her. Amara closed her eyes, breathing deeply. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over, but for the first time she felt a profound sense of purpose and peace. The months following the passage of the Community Accountability Act brought a mix of progress and challenges. The law's implementation was met with both celebration and resistance, but its impact was undeniable. Businesses across Atlanta were now required to participate in bias training, and customer rights were prominently displayed in public spaces. Slowly but surely, the city began to change. For Amara, life settled into a new rhythm. Her role as a community advocate expanded as she traveled to nearby cities, sharing her story and helping other communities push for similar legislation. The Equity Alliance grew into a regional organization, uniting activists and local leaders to tackle issues of discrimination and inequity. Despite her growing influence, Amara remained grounded. She still volunteered at the community center, helped Malik with his homework, and found time to connect with her neighbors. She never forgot the root of her journey, a single, unjust accusation that sparked a movement. The store became a model for inclusivity, its once fractured reputation slowly repaired by Rachel Nguyen's leadership and the dedication of her team. David Lopez continued to thrive in his role, mentoring new employees and advocating for fair treatment across the board. The advisory board, which Amara co-chaired, met monthly to review the store's policies and address any issues that arose. The meetings were often intense, but they were productive, providing a platform for open dialogue between the business and the community. One afternoon, as Amara walked through the aisles of Greenhaven, she was approached by a young employee. "Ms. Johnson," the woman said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did here, it made a difference. I feel safe working here now." Amara smiled warmly. "Thank you for saying that. It means everything to me." The backlash from critics remained a constant challenge. Some businesses tried to skirt the new requirements, and others outright refused to comply. Amara and the Equity Alliance monitored these violations closely, working with city officials to enforce the law. One night, as she prepared for bed, Amara received an email from a civil rights organization in another state. They wanted her help drafting a similar bill for their community. Amara read the message twice, the weight of the opportunity sinking in. They sat on a bench, watching families play and enjoying the rare moment of calm. Malik turned to her, his voice thoughtful. "Do you think things are better now, Mom?" he asked. Amara considered the question carefully. "They're getting better," she said. "But there's still work to do. That's why we keep going." Malik nodded, his small hand slipping into hers. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the city, Amara felt a deep sense of hope. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also been transformative. She wasn't just fighting for justice anymore. She was building a future for herself, for Malik, for everyone. 2 years later, Amara stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., addressing a packed auditorium at a national civil rights conference. Behind her, a large screen displayed the words, "Justice beyond the aisles, transforming systems, changing lives." She spoke with the calm confidence of someone who had weathered storms and emerged stronger. "This journey began with a single moment of injustice," Amara said, her voice resonating through the room. "But that moment became a movement. It taught me that no act of resistance is too small, no voice too quiet. Together, we can create a world where justice isn't just an ideal, it's a reality." The applause was thunderous, but as Amara looked out over the crowd, she saw Malik, now a teenager, smiling proudly in the front row. This was her legacy. Amara's story is a powerful reminder that change begins with courage. The courage to stand up, speak out, and refuse to accept injustice. But her fight isn't over, and neither is ours. Injustice, bias, and inequality persist in our communities, often hidden in plain sight. We each have the power to challenge these systems, whether by supporting organizations that fight for equity, educating ourselves about implicit bias, or simply listening to the voices of those who have been silenced. Take a stand today, share this story, start a conversation, and be part of the movement toward a fairer, more inclusive future.